ancient Stoics and our Historicism. Today we see many turning to ancient doctrines in the context of a modern upbringing. We are raised to take for granted that our thought, our self-understanding, is, as we say, historically relative. What does this mean? It means that our thought, our self-understanding, is shaped by external evolving forces, external to our own consciousness. These forces that affect us from without are mechanical in the respect that they are not stemming from a divine authority. They are, at any rate, not studied, understood, examined in terms of a divine end, of a divine mind. Thus, we speak of modern science or physics as studying the forces that impinge upon our consciousness. Again, these forces are mechanical in the respect that they are not studied in light of a divine end. Right? We study them mechanistically in terms of mechanisms. So there are mechanisms at work, mostly obscure to us at the present stage of the development of our sciences. And these forces that we study, that we assume to be independent of a divine authority, this is how we study them, are supposed to determine our own consciousness. I say determine too, not only affect tangentially, but ultimately determine, inform, so that our own consciousness, our thoughts, as we say, will change according to the circumstances of life. They're not static, of course. They're not once and for all deals. So we'll change our mind. In principle, we can change our mind about everything or anything. Right? Our most cherished convictions can be overcome in time. Things happen, and we might change our mind about everything. Well, what about changing our mind about this setup? About the fact that our mind is, or our thoughts, or our consciousness is determined, informed ultimately by external material forces. What about the thought about this whole scenario? Is this thought relative to our present condition? Or does it express the whole setup? And so, Historicism, or the doctrine of historical relativism, necessarily here we see presupposes this idea that ultimately historicism itself, or the thought of historicism, or the historical consciousness proper to the historical or the historicist doctrine, must be universal. It must express the whole. It must express the ultimate reality of things, the way things are set up. At least formally. We will still discover all kinds of things that change, but the pluralistic historicist vision is there to stay. Now, how is it there to stay? Because it is a direct expression of the fullness, right? The whole, the fullness of this dynamism, right? This dynamics that we are part of. Now, what about a universal end beyond, right? Beyond the relativity of our present condition? Well, that universal end is necessarily entailed presupposed, if only in a covert way, by our historicist or historical consciousness. How is that the case? If there is a whole, then the whole must be the end, for the sake of which we have the parts. So if we have a situation that is dynamic and ultimately really unstable, this instability would seem to feed into the whole, which must be as such stable. So we are, in this respect, playing out, right, a game, right, the rules of which are defined by the whole. Now, we have this consciousness of the whole. Now, we are in a special situation because in earlier times we could say we did not have this historical consciousness, but today we do, which is to say that now we're enlightened as regards to the whole, the nature of the whole. Therefore, we must understand our words, our language, our lives in a distinctively unique way, right? Not as the ancients did, not as earlier ages did, where people did not have this historical consciousness. We must understand everything that we say in a new context, in the context of our historical consciousness. And this fact will inform the way we live, the way we speak. Right? We will speak in a way that reflects our historical consciousness. We will live in a way that tells us that we are enlightened. So we're no longer going to fight over questions of ultimate ends, over the question of the nature of the whole. That question has been answered for us once and for all by the doctrine of historical relativism, historicism. Or in the terms of the modern physics or biology or the hard sciences or whatever you want to call them, in terms of evolution, the doctrine of evolution. That doctrine does not tell us whether there's a God or not, but it tells us how to live in the respect that it tells us how we are to understand the dynamics that are at work in the shaping of our consciousness. These dynamics are to be understood and studied, again, in mechanistic terms, as mechanisms. Whether there's an ultimate God or not is absolutely irrelevant here, because it is the mechanisms that count. Right? They are the ones that tell us what our situation is. Well, you could say, what about this God? If there is a God who has set up these mechanisms, what about him? Well, he must be at once the stability of the mechanisms. So it is through the mechanisms that we attain to God as stability. Now, the stability is a stability of consciousness. And so there again, we have a solution to our problems. God has, so to speak, called us to live in a mechanistic universe. Right? And this very fact, again, tells us how to live. We are to make choices, so to speak, assuming we do make choices, in terms of mechanisms. So the appeal to God in this case, scientific or even scientific appeal to God today, really feeds into the mechanistic life. The dream, for instance, that everything is organic, everything is beautiful, everything is filled with life, with the light of God, is simply going to fuel the view that we are to live in a mechanistic universe, whether we like it or not. We accept modern physics. We accept all these doctrines that we have, or the theories, if we like to call them that way, right, of relativity, of quantum this and quantum that, and all of these very sophisticated things that the little entities, subatomical entities, and all these things. There's this fractal universe. Becomes a kind of computer game, a video game we're all in. Right? And this computer game and our acceptance of the computer game is somehow either just there or it is justified, granted, bestowed upon us, or however you want to put it, by an ultimate whole, a stability that feeds us somehow into this video game. Now, in this respect, it makes no sense to speak of contemplation, the life of contemplation, as a fundamental end. We are to live in the video game. There's no such thing as the ascent from the video game to God. Why not? Because our thought is determined by the mechanisms. And we can have the thought of the whole, which sets the stage for us. But this thought is a merely formal one that tells us that we are mandated, if not condemned, sentenced at any rate, to live in a mechanistic universe. The idea, the classical idea, that we are to leave the mechanistic world as an illusion to rise into the fullness, the full actuality, the fullness of the divine, to contemplate things as they are permanently, or permanent features of the universe, and that this life of contemplation, this return to what is permanent, is the goal of everyday life. So we are not simply to follow the dynamics, to empower ourselves, as it were. We are dead. We're mortals. We're already dead. We're simply deluded, right? We're fooling ourselves into believing that we are somehow mastering our lives, our destiny, and empowering ourselves. We are already dead. So the ancient seeks liberation from this condition of men who are as in a dream. And how does he do that? By ascending to the divine. So necessarily, permanent features of reality are not just, shall we say, condemning us to live the life of compulsion, really, where our thought, our consciousness is determined by external mechanistic forces. The life of contemplation is appealed to as a consummation, right? It's participation in the divine mind, in pronoia, in providence, in the care that the mind of the universe, the mens mundi, the pneuma of the cosmos of the universe, that it has for all life forms. So we have this ascent toward the life of God, God as the supreme life form, or the supreme way of life, or, in fact, the actus purus, the pure act, or absolute actuality, what is ultimately at work in everything. Right. Historicism tells us no. Historicism tells us that the life of contemplation, for us, never escapes the mechanisms that inform us. That there is no ascent to the divine. Now, throughout antiquity, we have had questions about this possibility of ascending to the divine. And at some point, with a Socratic turn, we have seen that, well, we cannot ascend, but the divine is already present within our ascent. And while we cannot ascend in this life and attain to divine unity in this life, as mortals, we are participating in God's finding of man. God has already found us, which is to say that you could say that the infinite has already found the finite. The mind, the divine mind, is already at work in the finite mind or consciousness. So we are not to strive for the heavens, to grasp the heavens now. That would be foolishness. We are rather to moderate our lives so that our lives can reflect divine providence. And this is the key to classical life, a life that is poetic in the respect that our life is seen now as a poetic mirror, even an image of divine agency. Now, let us consider specifically the ancient Stoics. Ancient Stoics praise this idea of order or cosmos or mundus, right, as absolutely primordial over chaos. The ancient Stoics defended primordial order as the ground of human consciousness. Now, why did they do that? Why would they have done that? Well, they probably did that because there were detractors, right, of philosophy who were saying, well, ultimately, your thought is not well grounded. So they would say, no, it is grounded in the whole. So this fundamental primordial order is the foundation of the philosophical life, right? That is to say, the life oriented toward the primordial order, beyond all vulgar or physical passions. The passions should be ordered, so moderated, ordered toward this primordial order, ordered perfectly. The cosmos, which ultimately entails an animating thought, right, or mind of its own, an anima mundi. Right? So, this mind would define the path of man as man, right, for the anthropos, as one of return to the whole, right? The whole as a mind. Now, the return to divine providence, or pronoia, involves, of course, a departure from chaos. The often, chaotic dynamism, right, of life is not denied. It is compatible with the destiny we're called to fulfill. Right? As we gather ourselves, right, our order, our lives, back in a primordial order. So here we have a journey back into God as mind of the universe. And the whole classical tradition really is about this. Right? A journeying back into God. For ancient Stoics, there could be, therefore, no evolution of thought in the modern secular sense. No hypothetical infinite progress of the sciences, given that there is a natural hierarchy of ends, right? The ends pointing to the mind of the universe. So, ends involving a primordial order. Now, in God's eye, the universe is ultimately not evolving at all. Why not? Well, temporal progression ultimately yeah, is relative to the developing life form, okay, and is fulfilled or completed in the divine. So, in God's eye, the universe is, well, constituted of, we could say, forms or spheres of contemplation, of intelligibility. So God sees all things as complete in God. What about us? Well, God's thought extends, as it were, right, in finite life forms that are, well, thereby endowed with thought. So God thinks in us. So he's at work in us by thinking. So ultimately, the ultimate thought, the ultimate type of work is thought. Thought is really the energy that is within all of our work. The ultimate actuality. So we partake in God's own agency. Now, as we partake in God's mind, we have a sense of the unfolding of things, right? Of an evolution, in the context, however, of permanent ends or forms. And as our sense is gathered in God, as we have the sense that there is a whole, we begin to see things as more and more permanent, right? As things of the mind, as permanent problems that we cannot fix, alter, solve, but that ultimately are their own solution in God.